The grounds of Blackmore Hall had not seen rain in 11 days, and the earth along the northern path had cracked open in thin lines that ran like old scars between the stones. Gormal stood at the top of the hill, still as a boulder, his grey coat catching the last of the afternoon light. He was looking down toward the gate where the Tuesday coach had just stopped. Nobody moved to open the gate. The coachman sat rigid on his box, his hands white on the reins, his eyes fixed on the dog at the hill. The horse, a steady bay that had worked this route for 4 years without incident, pressed herself sideways against her harness and refused to go another step forward. Gormal did not growl, he did not lower his head or shift his weight. He simply stood there, watching, in the way that large and confident things watch when they do not yet need to do anything. It was the head groom, old Perrin, who finally came around the side of the coach and opened the gate himself, because someone had to and nobody else was going to. He did it without looking at the dog. He had learned that looking at the dog directly was an invitation to something he preferred not to receive. From inside the coach, a woman's voice said quietly, "Is it always this long?" Nobody answered her. She stepped out herself. She was slight, dressed in plain grey wool that had been washed many times, carrying a single bag that sat heavy on her shoulder. She looked at the hall, then at the hill, then at the dog on the hill in that order without changing her expression. Then she picked up her bag more firmly and walked through the gate. Perrin watched her from the corner of his eye. He had expected her to slow down or stop when she saw the animal. People always stopped. Even the Duke's own guests, lords and ladies who would never admit to being afraid of anything, found reasons to go through the side door when Gormal was near the main entrance. The woman did not slow down, she did not veer. She walked up the path at the same pace she had walked through the gate, looking straight ahead at the hall. Gormal watched her come. At a certain point, Perrin could not have said exactly when the dog's ears moved, just slightly forward. Not the flattened backward pull that meant warning. Forward, the way a dog listens when something has caught its full attention. The woman reached the front step, set her bag down, and knocked on the servants' entrance without once looking up the hill again. Perrin stood with the gate still in his hand and thought about that for a moment. Then he closed it and went back to his work, and said nothing to anyone about what he had seen, because he was not sure yet what he had seen. Her name was Elspeth Voss, and she had come in answer to an advertisement placed in the regional paper 3 weeks earlier. The advertisement had been brief. The Blackmore Hall estate required a general housemaid, experienced with strong references, able to begin immediately. It had not mentioned the dog. She was brought in through the kitchen by a young undercook named Lottie, who kept a careful distance and spoke very quickly, as though she had rehearsed what to say and wanted to get through it before she lost her nerve. "The hall has 14 rooms in regular use," Lottie said, "and the east wing which isn't. You'll be on the east side mostly, which is actually fine honestly because nobody else wants to be. The morning fire in the east corridor needs to be lit by 6, the scullery wants scrubbing on Tuesdays and Fridays, and the back stairs are your responsibility because—" She paused and then decided not to finish that sentence. "Mrs. Aldred, the housekeeper, will give you the rest." "Thank you," Elspeth said. "There's also—" Lottie started and then seemed to change direction. "The east wing, you'll hear things at night, just the house settling, old stone." "I understand." "And Gormal sleeps in the east passage. That's where the bed alcove is. He's usually there by 8. Elspeth nodded slowly. "Is there anything I should or shouldn't do around him?" Lottie stared at her. "Shouldn't do?" "To keep the peace." Lottie blinked. "You just don't go near him, that's the whole thing. You just, wherever he isn't, you go there. That's how we all manage." Elspeth looked at her calmly. "But I'll be lighting the east corridor fire by 6, which is where he sleeps." Lottie opened her mouth, closed it, and then said, "Mrs. Aldred will explain." Mrs. Aldred did not explain. Mrs. Aldred, a tall woman with iron-gray hair and the manner of someone who had decided decades ago to stop being surprised by anything, handed Elspeth a list of duties, pointed to a peg where her apron should go, and said only, "If Gormal is in a doorway, you wait until he chooses to move. You do not try to get past him, you do not speak to him, you do not look at him longer than it takes to confirm where he is. Is that clear?" "Yes." "Good. Morning starts at 5:30, the east fire at 6. She left. Elspeth looked at the apron on the peg and the list in her hand. She thought about the way the dog had watched her come up the path, the ears forward, the absolute stillness that was not the stillness of threat but of concentration. She had grown up in a farmhouse in the north where the working dogs were never pets but were not enemies either. They were colleagues, her father had said, with their own sense of what mattered and their own way of deciding who was worth knowing. You could not convince a good dog of anything. You could only behave in a way that let it reach its own conclusion. She folded the list, put it in her apron pocket, and went to find the east wing. The east wing smelled of old wood and cold stone, and faintly of the animal that lived in it. The passage was long and narrow, with 3 doors along the left wall and a single window at the far end that had been painted shut long ago. The floor was bare slate, worn smooth in the middle where generations of feet had passed. The bed alcove for Gormal was more than that, really. Someone at some point had built him a low wooden platform along the right wall of the passage, padded with several heavy blankets and a sheepskin. It was the size of a small bed. The platform was old, the wood had darkened with years of use, but the blankets were clean and had been recently folded. Someone cared for those blankets. Someone washed them and folded them back. Elspeth filed that information away without attaching any particular conclusion to it. She found the iron grate for the morning fire and crouched down to inspect it. It was clean enough. Ash from the last fire had been swept out. The basket beside it held dry wood and a handful of old paper twists for lighting. Everything was in order. She stood and looked at the passage. 14 steps from the grate to the dog's platform. She walked them off slowly. Then she walked back, picked up her bag from where she had left it at the passage entrance, and found the small room she had been assigned. It was at the far end of a different corridor, plain, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. It was, by any measure, one of the less desirable rooms in the house. She was not troubled by that. She had slept in worse. She laid out her few things, put her single other dress on the peg behind the door, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the quiet. Through the wall she could hear the distant kitchen sounds, pots, voices, the rhythmic thud of something being chopped. Outside, the cracked earth of the garden showed between the herb rows. She thought about the letter in her bag, the one she had carried from the previous household, the one from a household that no longer existed. She did not take it out. She already knew what it said. She lay down on the bed fully dressed, closed her eyes, and was asleep within 4 minutes, which was one of the things she had learned to do in the years since the fire. The first morning, she arrived at the east corridor at 10 minutes to 6. She had allowed extra time because she did not know yet how long the walk from her room took, and because she preferred to be early to things rather than rushed. She came around the corner of the passage entrance and stopped. Gormal was already awake. He was sitting up on his platform, not lying down, which meant he had heard her coming or sensed something or simply woken, and he had chosen to be sitting upright when she arrived. He was enormous. Sitting, his head was nearly level with her shoulder. His eyes in the early half-light were pale amber, almost gold. They looked at each other. Elspeth did not back away. She also did not advance. She stood where she was at the entrance to the passage and simply existed there for a moment, not performing calmness, not trying to project anything at all. Just being a person who had arrived at a corridor to light a fire and who happened to find another living creature already present. Gormal's nose moved. He was reading the air the way dogs do, cataloging, sorting, deciding. His ears were in the forward position again, not flattened, not raised for alarm, just forward, alert, focused. After a moment she walked to the grate, slowly, without rushing, but also without the exaggerated, careful stepping of someone who feared they were walking into danger. She crouched down in front of the grate and began setting the fire. She was aware of him the entire time. She was aware of the slight shift of weight on the platform when she crouched, aware of the quality of his attention, the focused, unblinking kind. She did not look at him, not because she had been told not to, but because it was not necessary and would have been a kind of statement, and she was not ready to make statements. The paper caught, the kindling followed. She fed the wood in carefully, one piece at a time, building the fire the way her father had taught her, with patience and with space, never smothering it with too much fuel at once. The fire grew. She sat back on her heels and watched it take hold, and felt the first threads of warmth reach her face, and did not move for a moment because the fire needed watching until it was fully established. Behind her, the platform creaked. She did not turn. There was a long moment in which she could feel, without seeing, that something large had moved in the space behind her. Then the warmth of the fire increased slightly, and she understood, because of the way it changed, the way the air shifted, that something large had come closer to it. She gave it another 2 minutes, then rose, collected her ash pan and left the corridor without looking back. In the kitchen, Lottie was starting the breakfast water. She looked up when Elspeth came in. "How did it go?" "Fine," Elspeth said. "The grate draws well." Lottie stared at her. "You lit the fire?" "Yes." "And Gormel was there?" "He was." Lottie put down her pot and... Elspeth took her apron from the peg. "And the fire is lit. What needs doing next?" By the end of the first week, people had begun to notice. It was the underfootman, a young man named Percy, who said it first at the servants' dinner on Friday evening. He said it carefully, as though he was not sure he was allowed to say it. He said that Gormel had been sitting outside the linen room that afternoon, and the only person in the linen room had been the new maid. There was a pause around the table. Then the stable lad said that he had seen the dog in the kitchen passage that morning, which was unusual because Gormel did not come into the kitchen passage. The dog had a general understanding of his territory that was not negotiable and had not changed in 4 years. But he had been in the kitchen passage that morning, sitting near the back door, and the new maid had come through the back door with a basket of dried herbs from the garden. Another pause. Mrs. Aldred at the head of the table said nothing. She continued cutting her bread and did not look up. "He didn't do anything," Percy clarified. "He was just sitting there." "He sits places," said Lottie. "He always sits places." "He sits in the east passage," Percy said. "He sits on his platform. He sits at the main stairs landing. He doesn't sit in the kitchen passage. He's never sat in the kitchen passage." Mrs. Aldred put down her knife. "Gormel is the Duke's animal and is not a subject for dinner conversation," she said. "Is there something wrong with the bread?" Nobody said there was anything wrong with the bread. But after dinner, Percy and Lottie and the stable lad all found separate reasons to walk past different parts of the house, and what they each saw, independently, at different times, through different windows and doorways, was the same thing. Gormel, the Duke's Irish wolfhound, who had bitten Lord Haverton's secretary, who had driven the last 3 visiting valets to request alternative lodging, who had once stood in the entrance hall for 45 uninterrupted minutes, while a visiting clergyman waited outside in the cold because nobody would go past the dog to open the door, was lying across the doorstep of the room where Elspeth Voss was sitting with a lamp, mending a tear in a pillowcase. Lying across it, not blocking it in warning, not alert, lying with his great head resting on his front paws, his eyes half closed, in the specific posture that dogs use when they are doing exactly what they want to be doing. Percy stared for a long time. Then he walked away very quietly, because it felt like the sort of thing you should not disturb. The Duke of Ashford, whose full name appeared in 2 county records and 1 legal document as Edmund George Wycliffe Ashford, though he was called simply the Duke by everyone in the hall and simply Edmund by nobody at all, became aware of the situation not through any report or deliberate observation, but through the simplest possible means. He walked around a corner and nearly stepped on his dog. Gormel was on the floor of the second landing corridor, stretched across the full width of the passage, asleep in the afternoon light that came through the high window. That was not unusual in itself. Gormel slept in many places and had a dog's absolute certainty that wherever he chose to rest was the correct place to rest, and that the inconvenience this caused to anyone else was their problem entirely. What was unusual was that there was a young woman on her knees 6 feet away from him, scrubbing the skirting board. The Duke stopped. He watched. The woman, he did not yet know her name, was working her way along the wall with a brush and a pail of water methodically, without haste. She was not looking at the dog. She was not watching him from the corner of her eye in the way that people watched Gormel when they thought they were being subtle. She was simply working. Gormel's ear twitched once, acknowledging the Duke's arrival, then the ear settled back. The dog did not raise his head. The Duke stood in the corridor for a moment, and then stepped carefully over his dog and went on down the passage and said nothing. He went to his study and found he was standing at his window looking at the view without actually seeing it. 4 years Gormel had been in this house. 4 years, and the list of people the dog tolerated was short enough to count on one hand, and not one of them could have crouched 6 feet from him in a narrow corridor and worked without him raising his head. The Duke went to the desk and found the estate correspondence. Near the bottom of last week's pile, he was not a man who prioritized domestic paperwork, was the letter of character that the new housemaid had presented on arrival. He read it once, then set it down, then read it again more slowly. It was competent, clearly written, precise about her duties, good in its description of her work. The household that had written it was listed at the top with an address in the north. He did not recognize the name of the establishment, which was not significant. He did not know every household in the north. What he noticed, and he noticed it because he was the kind of man who read things carefully, was the way the letter was dated. The date of the household's letterhead and the date the letter had actually been written, which appeared in a different hand at the bottom, were 11 months apart. Letters of character were typically written upon departure, close to the date at the top. He set the letter down. He was not a man who drew quick conclusions. He believed that conclusions reached quickly were conclusions that had decided before they looked, which was a different thing entirely from understanding. He put the letter back in the pile and told himself he would think about it when he had more reason to. Outside his window, the late afternoon had turned the moors a shade of copper and rust, and somewhere in the east wing, his dog was choosing to be near a woman whose name he did not yet know. Her name, he learned the next morning, was Elspeth. He learned it from Mrs. Aldred, who came to the study with the week's household accounts and mentioned, while she was there, that the new maid had settled well and that there had been no difficulties. Her name, he asked. Mrs. Aldred did not pause. Elspeth Voss, sir. From the north? Yes, sir. He nodded, returned to the accounts, and said nothing further. But 3 days later, coming back from the stables in the early morning, he passed through the east corridor and found the fire already burning in the grate, and Gormel on his platform, but not asleep, not entirely. The dog's head was raised, his ears forward, watching the end of the corridor where a figure had just disappeared around the corner. Edmund Ashfur stood still, and watched his dog watch the empty corridor for a moment after the figure had gone. Then he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Well." Gormel's ear turned toward him briefly, then turned back to the corridor. The Duke went to breakfast, and he thought about the way the dog's ear had moved, not the worried ear, not the flattened ear, but the easy, almost lazy rotation of an ear that hears something familiar, something expected, something that belongs. He had seen that ear position precisely twice before, once toward himself, on the first day he had brought Gormel home as a 2-year-old from the breeder in County Clare, once toward his wife in the first month after the dog arrived, before she fell ill. Not since. He sat at the breakfast table and ate his eggs, and said nothing about any of it to anyone. He was not built for saying things about ears. But he did not, after that, throw away the letter of character with the 2 dates. He put it in his desk drawer, which was where he put things he was not finished thinking about. The second week of Elspeth's employment at Blackmore Hall coincided with the arrival of a late frost that came without warning on a Tuesday night, and killed the early herbs in the kitchen garden, and put a thin skin of ice on the horse troughs that did not melt until afternoon. The cold moved through the old stone walls as though the walls were not there, and by morning the east corridor was genuinely bitter, and the fire in the grate, which Elspeth lit at 10 to 6, same as every morning, took longer than usual to build any real warmth. She was still crouched at the grate, coaxing the flame with small pieces of dry bark, when Gormel came off his platform. She heard it, the sound of his weight shifting, the soft knock of his nails on the stone, and she continued what she was doing because there was nothing else to do. The fire needed tending. She tended it. The sound of his movement stopped. She fed another piece of bark into the flame and watched the fire consider it. The corridor was very quiet. The morning had that particular frost quiet that muffles everything, and in the silence she became aware, without looking, that the dog was not on his platform any more but had not gone far. The quality of the air changed when something large stood nearby. You felt the displaced warmth of it, the presence. She fed another piece of wood. The fire accepted it. Then she heard him lie down. Not the careful settling of a dog who has chosen to lie somewhere unexpected and is not fully certain about it. The full, heavy, deliberate collapse of an animal that has decided on a place and intends to stay. The sheepskin sound of a great coat hitting stone. He had lain down between her and the corridor entrance. Not behind her, not to the side. Between her and the entrance, which was the warmest position relative to the growing fire, and which also happened to be the position that, in a dog's understanding, protected the person at the fire from anything that might come through the door. Elspeth said nothing. She did not move. She finished building the fire, confirmed it was drawing well, and then, because she had to, because her knees were cold and she had other things to do, she rose. She stepped carefully around him. He was too large to step over. She moved to his right, giving him space, and he watched her from under one raised eyebrow with the mild interest of a creature whose dignity was too secure to be disturbed by the fact that she had to navigate around him. She picked up her ash pan from the corner. At the doorway she paused, which she had not done before. She did not look back. She just paused for one breath, the way you might pause after a conversation that has gone unexpectedly well, the way you take a moment to notice that something has changed before you move on. Then she went to the kitchen, and Lottie handed her a cup of tea, and she drank it standing up at the window watching the frost on the kitchen garden, and did not mention the dog. Elspeth was not a woman who volunteered information. This was not evasion. It was simply that she had been raised in a household where talk was for necessary things, and unnecessary things were left to take care of themselves. Her father had been a man of few words. Her mother had communicated primarily through the efficient deployment of tasks. If you needed something from her, she was more likely to put a meal in front of you than to ask what was wrong. This had suited Elspeth very well. She was comfortable with silence in the way that people are comfortable with something they have known since childhood, and she had no particular sense that this was unusual. The other staff at Blackmore Hall had, in the first week, made several attempts to know her better. Lottie had asked about where she was from. Percy had mentioned a social gathering in the village on Saturday that several of the hall staff attended. The stable lad, whose name was Ned, and who was 17 and painfully aware of the fact, had told her at length about the local geography in a way that had everything to do with wanting to be helpful and nothing to do with the landscape. She had been kind in each case. She had answered Lottie's question directly, told Percy that she might come if she wasn't needed, and listened to Ned's description of the footpath to the village without interrupting. She was not cold. She was simply contained. There was a quality to her attention that made people feel heard without feeling that they had learned anything in return. It was this quality, she thought sometimes, that animals responded to. Not warmth exactly, steadiness. An absence of the particular anxious noise that people make when they are uncertain or afraid or wanting to be liked. Animals did not know what to do with that noise. It confused them, made them unsure, because they were reading intention, and intent was harder to read when it was wrapped in a constant low-level performance of itself. She was not performing anything, she was simply there. And Gormel, who was one of the best readers of people she had ever encountered in any species, appeared to have recognized this from the first morning. On the 9th day, she found something on the platform in the east corridor. It was a book, a small thin volume with a dark cover, lying on the folded sheepskin at the edge of the platform as though someone had set it down and meant to come back for it. She picked it up and looked at the cover. It was a natural history of the Irish Wolfhound breed, printed 30 years earlier. The binding was cracked with use, the pages worn soft at the corners in the way that much-handled books become. Inside the front cover, in a neat small hand that was not the hand from the letter of character she had seen in Mrs. Aldrid's files, someone had written a name, not a human name, just the name, Gormel. She turned a few pages. There were marks in the margins, faint pencil notes in the same small hand. A passage about the breed's origin had been underlined. A paragraph about their loyalty had 3 small lines beside it in the margin, the kind of marks that mean this particularly. She didn't read the text. It wasn't hers to read, but she noted the marks. She set the book back exactly where she had found it and went about her work. The next morning, the book was gone. She did not ask about it. She mentioned it to no one. But she filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept observations that were not yet conclusions. Someone in this house read about this animal. Someone cared enough to mark the pages about his loyalty. Someone knew that word, loyalty, was the important one. She thought about the Duke's face, which she had seen only twice. Once from a distance when he crossed the main hall, and once at the breakfast room door when she had been in the corridor with a cloth, and he had come through and looked briefly at her without speaking. He was not an unkind-looking man. He was simply a careful one. He held himself with the particular uprightness of someone who has learned that letting things show is a way of giving people access to things they have no right to. She recognized it because she held herself the same way. The 3rd week brought a visitor. His name was Arthur Finch, and he was the estate's quarterly solicitor, a small, neat man who arrived on Wednesday mornings with a briefcase and a manner that suggested he believed himself to be important. He was not important, or not in any way that mattered to the daily life of the hall, but he believed it with enough conviction that the staff worked around it in the way you work around something fixed and immovable. Finch was afraid of Gormal. This was not unusual. Most visitors were afraid of Gormal. What made Finch specifically interesting was the way he was afraid, not the honest fear of someone who recognized a large animal and kept a reasonable distance, but the performed fear of someone who wanted everyone around him to know that he was afraid, because being afraid of Gormal had become, among people who visited the hall, a kind of social credential. It meant you had been there. It meant you had seen the animal. He came through the main entrance on Wednesday morning and immediately began narrating his own experience. "There he is," he said, to no one in particular, stopping 8 feet from Gormal, who was lying near the main stairs. "There's the beast. Magnificent and terrifying, isn't he? I've been coming here 3 years and I still, yes." Well. Gormal did not look at him. This was, in Elspeth's observation, Gormal's most cutting response to any person. Not a growl, not a raised lip, not even the cold assessment of the gold eyes, simply not looking. It was the same as saying, "You are not interesting enough to warrant attention." Finch went to the Duke's study and spent 2 hours there with his papers, and when he came out for the midday meal, he found himself in the corridor at the same time as Elspeth, who was carrying a tray to the small dining room. "Ah," he said, in the way that certain men address women they consider below their notice but feel they ought to acknowledge. "The new girl." "Good afternoon," she said, and kept walking. "The Wolfhound," he said to her back, apparently deciding that the dog was a good topic for any conversation. "I understand he's become quite attached to you. Very irregular, very strange indeed." She stopped because she was carrying a tray and he was standing slightly in her path. "He sits in the east corridor where I work," she said. "We are used to each other." "More than that, I hear." He had the look of a man who had been given interesting information and was deploying it. "Mrs. Aldred tells me, well, she didn't tell me, but I gathered that he goes where you go." "Dogs move around," she said pleasantly. Finch looked at her with the mild frustration of a man who wants to be the person who explains things and keeps finding that the person he's explaining to already knows. "You're not concerned by it. The other staff find him rather alarming." "I find him manageable," she said. He considered several responses to this and settled on none of them. She moved past him with the tray, and he watched her go with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered in a conversation about nothing. The day it truly began, the day that things shifted from interesting to something she had not named for herself yet, was the day it rained. It was a spring storm that came up from the south without much warning, and it arrived while Elspeth was in the garden. She had gone out to bring in the last of the kitchen herbs before the frost could take them, and the rain came down before she got halfway through the row. She ran for the nearest shelter, which was the garden shed at the far end of the path, and she made it inside just as the sky came down in earnest. The shed was full of old tools and empty clay pots and the smell of soil and metal, and the rain hit the tin roof in a roar that made thought difficult. She stood in the doorway, watching the garden turn to silver and mud. Then she heard the sound behind her. She turned, and Gormal was in the shed. She did not know when he had arrived or where he had come from. The shed door was barely large enough to admit him, and he had to dip his great head to enter, but he had entered, and now he stood in the middle of the shed looking at her with the alert, considering calm that was his default expression. She stared at him for a moment. Then she pulled the clay pot that served as a stool to one side, sat down on it, and looked out at the rain. He came and stood beside her in the doorway, looking out also. After a moment he lowered himself, in the slow, deliberate way of very large dogs, to the floor of the shed, and sat there with his side just barely touching her knee. The rain came down. Elspeth had learned, in the years since the fire, how to exist in small enclosures without the walls pressing in. She had learned to focus outward, on the window, the door, the visible way out, and to breathe slowly and let the small space be just a small space rather than a trap. She breathed slowly, watching the rain. Gormal's warmth spread through the side of her leg where his fur touched her, and she became aware that this was the first time she had been warm on that side since the frost came. She said, without planning to say anything, "I had a dog once. He was not as large as you." She paused. "He was not as dignified either. He stole things. He stole a butter dish once and hid it under the porch, and we found it 2 months later." Gormal's ear turned toward her. His name was ordinary, just plain, embarrassing ordinary. I called him Pip. He would have been enormously embarrassed to be compared to you." The ear settled back. She looked at the rain and said nothing else for a while. But the silence after the words felt different from the silence before them, softer, somehow, or more settled, the way air feels after a window is opened. The rain ran in thick rivers along the garden path. The tools hung on their hooks behind her, the clay pots stacked in their columns, and the shed sat around them both with the comfortable indifference of a space that has held many things and holds another thing now and has no opinion about it. She did not tell him about the fire. She did not say anything about the house, or the man whose house it had been, or the 11 months she had spent in the north afterwards, or what the inquest had said or had not said. She said none of that. She sat in a garden shed in the rain and told him about a butter dish and a dog named Pip, and it was enough. When the rain stopped, she stood up, and Gormel stood a fraction of a second after her, and they walked back to the house together, she carrying the handful of herbs she had managed to rescue, he at her left shoulder, precisely one step behind. At the kitchen door she paused and looked at him. He looked at her. "Right," she said quietly. She went inside. He did not follow her into the kitchen, that had never happened. But she looked back once through the window and saw him sitting at the kitchen door, looking in, and then looking away when he saw her looking, with the absolute dignity of a creature who will not be caught doing something tender. She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling, and went to hang up her herbs. It was Ned, the stable lad, who first used the word. He said it at the servants' dinner on Friday, very casually, as though it were not a significant thing to say. "He's her shadow," Ned said. "That's all it is. She's just got a shadow that's 6 stone and could knock a door off its hinges." There was a pause, and then Lottie laughed, and then Percy laughed, and even Mrs. Aldridge's mouth moved at one corner in something that was close to an expression. "Her shadow," Percy repeated. "Gentle though," Ned said thoughtfully. "That's the thing, he's never gentle, but when he's with her he looked for the word and did not find it. He's just quiet." Mrs. Aldridge looked at her plate. She had seen things in 30 years of service in this house and the house before it, and she had learned that the world sorted itself eventually into what it was. You could not hurry it. You could not interpret it ahead of time. You could only watch and wait and see what it turned out to be. What she saw these 3 weeks in was a woman who did her work without complaint and without drama and without asking for anything, and a dog who had spent 4 years being the most feared creature on the estate and was now choosing, with the complete certainty of an animal that knows what it knows, to be somewhere else. She thought about the letter with the 2 different dates. She had noticed it also. She was Mrs. Aldridge and she noticed things. She had not said anything about it. There was nothing yet to say. A letter written at a different time than the date on the paper was not evidence of anything except that whoever wrote it had not been organized that particular day. But she thought about it. And she watched and she waited and she said nothing. And when dinner was finished, she told everyone to clear their plates and get to bed. And she went to her own room and sat with her tea in the chair by the window and looked at the dark moors and thought that the world was a complicated thing, and that it sorted itself eventually. Gormel, somewhere in the east wing, settled into his sheepskin for the night, and in a different corridor Elspeth Voss lay with her eyes open in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the house breathe around her before sleep came. April came to Blackmore Hall in the usual way, slowly and then all at once, the way the moors go from brown to green when you are not paying attention, and then one morning you look and everything has changed. The light came back into the long evenings. The frozen earth softened under the kitchen garden. The birch trees along the north wall sent out their pale, tentative leaves. In the 5th week of Elspeth's employment, a thing happened that the staff would talk about, in low voices and with genuine wonder, for the rest of the year. It involved Lord Haverton's nephew, a young man named Cecil Haverton, who arrived on a Thursday afternoon with 2 trunks and a very small terrier that he kept on a long lead, and that barked at everything within range with the unshakable conviction of a very small animal that has never been told it is very small. Cecil was 22, fashionable in the way that young men of his circle were fashionable, and he had the open face and cheerful manner of someone who has not yet experienced anything that has surprised him unpleasantly. He was not a bad person. He was simply young in the way that requires the world to arrange itself around him before he has learned that it will not. He arrived knowing about Gormel. Everyone who came to the hall knew about Gormel. Cecil had heard the story of the footman's arm, and the story of the valet, and the story of the front entrance, and he had the adventurous attitude of someone who thinks a story about a frightening animal is really a story about an exciting experience waiting to happen. "I want to see him," he said to Percy 20 minutes after arriving while still in his coat. "Where is he?" Percy, who had been employed at the hall for 3 years and had developed a refined sense of self-preservation, said, "I'd suggest waiting, sir, until—" "Where is he? Come on." Gormal was in the library, which was unusual. He rarely went into the library. But he had gone there that afternoon, for reasons that were his own, and he was lying under the long reading table when Cecil Haverton came through the door with the terrier on its lead, and the terrier saw the wolfhound and the terrier lost his mind entirely. The small dog launched itself forward with the leash going taut, and a sound coming from it that should not have been possible from an animal that size, a shrill, committed, absolutely fearless sound, the sound of a creature that intends to settle something. Gormal raised his head from under the table and looked at the terrier. The terrier, to its credit, did not stop. It continued to bark and strain at the leash with complete dedication to a task that its brain had decided was essential. Cecil stood in the doorway and gripped the leash and looked at the wolfhound. Gormal looked at the terrier for a moment in the way that a very old library looks at someone who enters it too loudly. Then he stood up, with the slow, unhurried dignity of something that has not been threatened, and walked toward the door. Cecil stepped to one side. The terrier, as Gormal passed within 3 feet of it, fell completely silent. That was the thing that everybody talked about afterward. Not Gormal's reaction to the terrier, which was essentially no reaction, but the terrier's reaction to Gormal coming close. The dog simply stopped, mid-bark, mid-strain. The leash went loose and the dog sat down and was quiet, and Gormal walked past it and out the library door without acknowledging it further. Elspeth was in the corridor when he came out. She was carrying a stack of folded towels. She looked at Gormal, looked past him at the open library door where Cecil Haverton stood with his silent terrier, and then looked back at Gormal. "Successful afternoon," she said quietly. Gormal turned left and went up the corridor, and she fell into step in her usual way, towels balanced against one shoulder, and they went up the passage together, and Percy, who had watched all of it from the end of the hall, stood very still and thought about how he would describe this at dinner. The watching began in the 4th week. The Duke had not, before this, been a man who observed his own household with any particular attention. He managed it, the accounts, the maintenance, the occasional personnel matter that Mrs. Aldred escalated, but managing was not the same as watching. Managing was looking at a thing through paper. Watching was standing at a window and seeing what the thing actually was. He was not sure when he had started watching. He suspected it was gradual, the way comprehension is sometimes gradual. You understand something a little more each time you see it, until one day the understanding is complete and you realize you have been building it without knowing. What he understood by the end of the 4th week was that Gormal was not simply following Elspeth Voss around the hall. He was organized around her. There was a distinction. A dog that follows is moving reactively, going from place to place after the fact. What Gormal was doing was subtler and more interesting than that. The dog appeared on regular occasions to know where she was going before she went there. He would be at the bottom of the back stairs when she came down from the upper rooms. He would be already lying in the east corridor when she arrived to lay the fire. He would be at the door of whatever room she was scheduled to clean, not waiting outside it, not pacing, simply already there, settled, as though he had known and come ahead. It was the behavior of an animal that had developed an independent understanding of another creature's routine. It required attention, memory, and care. It required, in other words, something that looked very much like thought. Edmund Ashfur found this interesting in the way that things are interesting that you have not encountered before and do not have a category for. He also found it interesting, and this was the part he was slower to admit to himself, that Elspeth Voss appeared equally calibrated to the dog. She did not startle when she found him waiting. She did not perform surprise or perform welcome. She simply incorporated him into whatever she was doing, moved around him when necessary, acknowledged him with a word or a glance when he was directly in her path, and otherwise proceeded. The two of them moved through the halls of his house with a naturalness that he could only describe, privately, as established. Two people who had known each other a long time moved like that. Two people who had come to a specific understanding of each other's nature, who had negotiated, without words, without drama, how to be in shared space. He thought about the letter with the 2 dates. He thought about it more than he had told himself he would. He was not a man who believed in signs. He was not superstitious, not sentimental, not given to reading significance into things that were probably coincidence. He had been raised by a father who regarded sentiment as a form of imprecision, and he had inherited this view enough that it still shaped the way he thought, even when he suspected it was limiting him. But he believed in evidence, not evidence as a court understood it, cold, documented, provable. Evidence as the accumulation of things seen. You watched long enough and you understood what you were seeing. His father had said that also, and it was the better of the 2 lessons. He had been watching Gormel for 4 years. He knew the dog. He knew the difference between the animal's performance of aggression and its actual aggression, knew the difference between its social alarm and its genuine discomfort, knew the range and meaning of every posture and sound that the animal produced. He had made it his business to know, because a dog you do not understand is a danger you cannot manage, and he was not a man who permitted unmanaged dangers in his own house. What the dog was showing Elspeth Voss, what the dog produced in her presence, was rest. That was the word. Not happiness, which was too large and too vague, not affection, which described something mutual. Rest. The animal in her vicinity was at rest in a way it was not at rest anywhere else. He had not seen that in 4 years. He sat at his desk and looked at the accounts and thought about what a person would have to be to produce that in Gormel. It was Lottie who told her. Lottie was not a gossip, exactly. She was simply someone who found that information did not sit comfortably inside her for long. She came to find Elspeth one evening after the kitchen work was done, when Elspeth was in her room with her lamp and the borrowed book. She had taken a history of the county from the small shelf in the servants' corridor, a thing she did not think anyone would mind, and she knocked and came in when invited and sat on the chair by the window with the air of a person who has decided that someone should know something. "The Duke watches you," Lottie said. Elspeth turned a page. "Watches me how?" Like Lottie searched for a useful comparison, like how you watch something that you are trying to understand, not in a wrong way, just in a looking way. Elspeth considered this for a moment. From where? Doorways mostly, corridors. He was at the end of the upper hall this morning when you were coming down the stairs with the linen basket. Percy noticed. And 3 days ago he was at the landing window when you and Gormel were in the garden. Elspeth closed the book on her finger. Does he watch other staff? No, Lottie was very definite about this. Mrs. Aldred sometimes when there's something to discuss, but that's not watching, that's just looking because you're about to speak to someone. He might be watching Gormel. Lottie was quiet for a moment. He might be. Elspeth opened the book again. Doesn't it bother you? Lottie asked. No. If it were me, I'd be, I don't know, worried, I think, whether I'd done something wrong. Elspeth looked at the page. If I'd done something wrong, Mrs. Aldred would tell me. She turned the page. He's watching the dog. The dog happens to be near me. It's interesting to him because it's unusual. I would find it unusual too if I were him. Lottie regarded her with the frustrated admiration of someone who cannot decide if the other person is very secure or simply not paying enough attention. And you're not curious at all about why he does it, what he's thinking. Elspeth looked up. She looked at the window, which reflected the lamp and the room and their faces in the dark glass. Then she looked at Lottie. Of course I'm curious, she said. I'm just careful about what I do with curiosity. Lottie did not entirely understand this answer. But she got up and said good night and went back down the corridor, and Elspeth sat with the book and the lamp and the reflection of herself in the dark window, and outside, somewhere in the east passage, Gormel settled in for the night. The month turned and the days lengthened further, and one evening the Duke went down to the east corridor not for any particular reason. There was no particular reason that he gave himself, though there might have been one he was not examining, and found it empty. The fire was laid but not lit, which meant it was too late in the evening for the fire, which had already been lit and burned and gone out on schedule. The platform was there with the sheepskin folded, but Gormel was not on it. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he heard them. From the direction of the back passage, not in it, but near it on the other side of the garden door, the sound of low human speech, and beneath it, the particular sound that Gormall made sometimes when he was settled and content, which was not quite a growl and not quite a sigh but something between, a sound from deep in the chest that meant this is exactly where I should be. He did not go to the door. He stood where he was and listened, and after a moment he could not quite make out the words but he could hear the tone, even, gentle, conversational, in the way of someone talking to another creature not to be understood, but simply to give the animal the sound of a human voice that means well. He stood in the east corridor for a time that was probably shorter than it felt, and then he went back to his study and sat at the desk with the lamp and the account books, and did not open them. He thought about rest. He thought about what it meant that the dog, who had chosen for 4 years to be near no one, had chosen her. He thought about loyalty, which was the word someone had underlined in a book in this house, which was his book and his underlining, done the first year when the dog came home, and he was still learning what he had committed to. He had committed to Gormall completely. He had never wavered in that. The dog was his, and his care of the dog was total, and anyone who found that excessive could find somewhere else to stay. He thought about what it meant to commit to something completely, to a creature, to a way of living, to the particular quality of attention that a good animal deserved. He sat at his desk and thought about this for a long time, and then put the lamp out and went to bed, and lay in the dark for a while before sleep came. The Duke of Ashford had not always been a quiet man. This was a fact known only to people who had known him before his wife, before the years that followed her death, before the long, careful building of the particular life he had now. To the staff at Blackmore Hall he had always been this, contained, efficient, private, running the estate with precision and never wasting a word. Mrs. Aldred had known him before. She had come to the hall when he was 19 and she was 30, and she had seen the version of him that had opinions about things and said them, that had laughed in the drawing room and invited people to stay for weeks, that had ridden across the moors in the early morning just because the morning was good, and the riding was good, and life was something to move through fast. She watched him now in the 6th week of Elspeth's employment, and she watched him carefully, because she was the only person in the house who knew what she was looking at. He was not exactly behaving differently. He was still precise, still contained, still the man who went over the accounts and spoke to the estate manager on Thursday afternoons and attended the relevant parish meetings because they were his obligation, and he took obligations seriously. All of that was the same. But he was going to the east corridor in the early morning more frequently than he had before, not always, not in a way that would be noticeable to someone who was not watching, but Mrs. Aldred was watching and she noticed. She also noticed, and this she found more interesting, that he had begun to speak to Gormall. The Duke had always managed the dog in silence. Commands, when he gave them, were single words, here down enough, delivered in a tone of neutral authority that Gormall received as he received everything, with equanimity and a comprehensive personal confidence. They had, over 4 years, developed a working relationship that was functional and clear, and involved very little unnecessary communication on either side. Now twice, Mrs. Aldred had heard the Duke say something to the dog that was not a command. The first time she had been at the far end of the upper hall and had heard him come down the stairs and heard him say, to Gormall who was at the bottom, she could not hear the words, only the tone, something that was low and conversational and not a command. The second time she had been in the housekeeper's room with the door ajar and she had heard him in the corridor outside, and she had heard him say quite distinctly, "Go on, then." Not to her, not to Percy, to the dog which had gone on down the corridor in the direction of the east wing. Go on, then, 2 words that could mean many things, but in the context of a man who had not previously offered his dog non-functional commentary, they were, to Mrs. Aldred's experienced ear, significant. She said nothing. She was not a person who said things before she understood them, but she noted it in the register that she kept in her mind of things that were accumulating toward a conclusion. Elspeth, for her part, had spent these weeks discovering the house. She had spent the first weeks learning the work, the routes, the schedules, the particular requirements of each room and each surface and each time of day. This was the practical geography of the place, and she had mastered it with her usual efficiency and without drawing much comment. The discovery was different. It was the other map of a house, not where the rooms were but what they held, what they had been. The personality of a place which was always made of the personalities of the people who had shaped it, and which persisted past those people in the grain of the furniture and the weight of the curtains, and the particular way the light fell through particular windows in the late afternoon. She had been discovering, specifically, that this was a house that had been happy once. This was not visible in the obvious ways, not in the decor, which was plain and practical, not in the staff, who were efficient and not unhappy but not warm either. It was visible in the smaller things. The wear on the banister rail at the exact height where a hand would rest easily. The deep score in the kitchen table where, for years, someone had cut bread on the same spot. The garden path, which still traced a curved line around a space where, from the depth of the worn stone, something had stood for a long time, a bench perhaps or a tree that was no longer there. A house that had been lived in fully left marks. Those marks were still here, they had just been alone for a while. She found in the small room off the east wing that nobody used, and that was not technically her responsibility, a painted portrait that had been turned to face the wall. She did not touch it. She did not turn it back. But she noted its position, the fact of its facing away, the coat of dust that suggested it had been this way for years. She thought about this sort of thing in the evenings, with her lamp and her borrowed books. She was good at reading houses the way she was good at reading animals, through the accumulation of small things rather than through direct inquiry. What the house told her across these weeks was that Edmund Ashfur had once been someone who used the whole of his life, and now used only part of it. The unused part had not vanished. It was here, in the worn banister rail and the garden bench space, and the painting facing the wall. It was here in the way the east wing had been assigned to the dog, as though a part of the house needed its own occupant even if the human one had retreated. She said none of this to anyone. But she thought it in the evenings, and she thought about the man she saw in corridors and doorways, careful, upright, not unkind, and she thought about what Gormel had chosen, and what it meant that the dog with the best judgment in the county had made a decision about her in the first 5 minutes and had not revised it. The incident with the water barrel happened on a Tuesday. The barrel stood at the north side of the house, where the roof ran off into it in wet weather, and where it was used for the garden in dry spells. It was old and had been old before Elspeth arrived, and on Tuesday morning it chose to express its age by splitting along the lower seam with a sound like a pistol shot, and releasing approximately 40 gallons of water across the north path in one cold, efficient movement. Elspeth was on the north path. She was not directly in front of the barrel when it went, which was fortunate, but she was close enough that the wave of water caught her from the knees down and knocked her sideways into the low wall that ran along the path edge. She sat down hard on the cold, wet stone of the path. She was not hurt. She had banged her palm on the wall and her knees were soaked, and she was sitting in an expanding pool of cold water, but she was not hurt. She knew this within 3 seconds, having checked the way you check when something goes quickly. Is everything working? Yes. Is there pain that means damage? Number. Is there embarrassment? Yes, considerable. She sat on the wet path and took stock. Gormel came around the corner of the north wall at speed that she had not previously seen from him, not running exactly, but moving with a focused urgency that covered the distance very quickly. He came directly to her and did not slow down until he was close enough to put his nose to her face, which he did, thoroughly and without apology. It was the first time he had done that. She sat on the wet path and let him inspect her with the seriousness of an animal that has identified a potential emergency and is making its own determination about the severity. His nose covered her hands, her face, her wet knees with the focused attention of a physician on rounds. "I'm fine," she said. He pulled back and looked at her. He was close enough that she could see the individual hairs in his eyebrow ridges and the old, fine scar along his jaw that she had never been close enough to see before. "I promise," she said, "the barrel is the casualty here, not me." He sat down beside her, on the wet path, which was a significant gesture from an animal of his dignity. She looked at him for a moment. Then, because the path was cold and getting colder, and there was nothing to be gained from sitting in a pool of water any longer, she put her hand on his back and pushed herself to her feet. She had touched him before, in passing, the accidental brush of her hand near him, the natural contact of close work in close quarters. She had never reached for him deliberately. He was very still under her hand, not tense, still in the way of something that is receiving something it was not expecting and is deciding what to think about it. She stood up, took her hand away, and looked at the ruined barrel and the flooded path. "Right," she said. This is going to need Perrin. She walked back to the stable yard to find the groom, and Gormel walked beside her, and this time he was not behind her left shoulder. He was level with her, exactly even with her, side by side. She noted this without remarking on it. That evening the Duke was in the East Corridor. He did not have a reason to be in the East Corridor. This had been true, increasingly, of several of his East Corridor appearances, and he had moved past the point of manufacturing reasons, and had arrived at a slightly uncomfortable place where he acknowledged to himself, privately, that he came because he wanted to know whether she was there. She was not there. She was, he deduced from Gormel's position. The dog was at the East Passage entrance, looking toward the kitchen, somewhere in the direction of the kitchen, which meant she had finished the evening work in the East Wing and had gone to get whatever they were all getting at this hour, which he believed was supper. He stood in the corridor and looked at his dog. Gormel looked back at him. There was a quality of communication in a look from Gormel that was not language but was not nothing. The dog was not simply returning the look. The dog was, Edmund was careful about this word, careful not to overinvest it, responding to the look, reading the look, and looking back with a directness that carried something in it. "You have made yourself very clear," the Duke said quietly to the dog. Gormel turned his head back toward the kitchen end of the corridor. "I understand that," Edmund continued, in the low voice he used for private speech, the one that nobody was supposed to hear. "You are under no obligation to make my decisions simple." The dog did not appear to agree or disagree with this. He was focused on the kitchen end of the corridor. Edmund stood for a moment, then he went to the letter in his desk drawer. He took it out and read it again for the fourth time, the letter of character from the house in the north, the 2 dates, the competent, precise description of a woman who did good work. He had been going back to this letter for 5 weeks, and not finishing the thought that it started. The thought was this: something had happened at that house. Something significant enough that whoever wrote this letter had written it on a day 11 months after the date on the letterhead, which meant the day had not come before then, which meant Elspeth Voss had left that house, or had needed to leave that house, before a letter was written for her. He was not naive about what that could mean. He was also aware that it could mean a dozen ordinary things: a disorganized employer, an illness that had delayed the writing, a simple oversight corrected later. He sat at his desk and looked at the letter and thought about the Beryl incident, which Perrin had mentioned at the end of the afternoon, in the way that Perrin mentioned things directly, without commentary. "The North Beryl gave out today, caught the maid on the path, she's all right. Gormel was with her before I got there." Before I got there. Edmund put the letter back in the drawer. He was not finished thinking about it. He was, in fact, further from finished than he had been a week ago, but he was becoming more certain about the direction of the thought, and that was something. He closed the drawer, opened the account books, and did his work. The morning of the 7th week was the one Elspeth would remember longest later, when she was not at Blackmore Hall and was trying to map the shape of what had happened to her there. Not the most dramatic morning, not the morning with the most significant event, but the one that she came back to, the one that she thought, that was when I understood what this place was. It began at 5:30, when she woke to rain on the window and lay still for a moment listening to it before she got up. The cold was back, a grey, wet cold that came with the April rains and was worse, in some ways, than the frost had been, because it was the cold of water-soaked stone that held the chill all day. She dressed, took up her lamp, and went to the East Corridor. Gormel was awake and standing, not alert in the alarm sense, but standing, in the posture he used when he was accompanying rather than resting, his head level, his stance organized in the particular way that said, "I know where we are going." She raised an eyebrow at him. "Good morning to you too." He went ahead of her down the corridor, not far ahead, just far enough to be leading rather than following. She watched this with the specific interest of someone observing a thing they have not seen before. He had never done this. For the 7 weeks she had been here, he had come with her or been ahead of her or waited for her. He had not, until now, led. She followed him to the garden door. She stood at the door and looked out. The rain was moderate, the garden dark and wet, and she could not, from where she was standing, see anything particular out there. "What is it?" she said quietly. Gormel looked back at her once, then forward at the door. She opened the door. The cat was under the lavender bush nearest the path. It was a young cat, not quite full grown, drenched to the skin and sitting in the rain with the particular hunched misery of a very wet animal that has lost its capacity for optimism. When the door opened, it looked up with eyes that were very large and not hopeful. Elspeth stood in the doorway and looked at the cat and then at Gormel, who had gone to the edge of the path and stopped. "Did you know it was there?" she asked. The dog did not answer, being a dog. She went out in the rain, which was not warm, and collected the cat from under the lavender bush, and brought it inside, and stood in the kitchen corridor with it wrapped in her apron while it vibrated with either cold or distress or both. Lottie arrived 20 minutes later for the breakfast start and found the east corridor fire lit, a damp cat in the old basket near the grate, and Gormel lying 2 feet from the basket, not in it, not close to the cat, but present in the way that constituted supervision. Lottie looked at this arrangement for a long moment. "Is that Gormel?" she said, even though she could see it was. "It is," Elspeth said, already on her way to the linen room. Lottie looked at the Wolfhound, who did not look back at her. She looked at the cat, which was small and orange and still damp, and was looking at the Wolfhound with the cautious assessment of an animal that cannot decide whether it has been rescued or eaten. "All right," Lottie said, to no one in particular. "All right, then." The cat stayed. Nobody decided this exactly, it simply stayed. The basket near the east grate became its basket. Gormel continued to lie near it with the air of a creature performing a civic duty, and the cat, who turned out to be female and was named by Ned the stable lad before anyone could stop him, and was named Sixpence, which nobody thought was a good name but which stuck anyway, became in the space of a week as much a part of the east wing as the stone floors and the old woodwork. The Duke noticed the cat on his second morning visit to the east corridor. He stopped and looked at the basket, he looked at Gormel, he looked at Elspeth, who was at the grate. "There is a cat," he said. "Yes," she said. "She was outside in the rain, she's young." I thought she paused because she was in the position of having assumed something without being given permission, and she was aware of this and aware that she should have asked. "I should have asked, sir. I'm sorry. If you prefer, I find her a place in the stables." "She's fine there," he said. Elspeth looked at him briefly. He was looking at the cat, which looked back at him with the frank assessment that cats perform on people they have just met. Then the cat looked at Gormel, then back at the Duke, then began washing its face with the calm priority setting of a creature that has decided the situation is manageable. The Duke watched this for a moment, then he said to Elspeth, and not as though it was an important question, "Has he bothered her at all?" "No. He found her, I think. He brought me to the door." A short silence. "The dog found the cat and brought you to it." "That's how it appeared, yes." He looked at Gormel once more, with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he already understood. Then he said, "Good," in a tone that closed the topic and went on. After he left, Elspeth stayed at the grate for a moment and she thought about the word. Good, the way he'd said it. Not good meaning, "The cat is fine, no harm done." Good meaning something else. Something she did not put a word to immediately but sat with carefully, the way you sit with something that is not yet fully visible. It was during the 8th week that she learned about the wife. She did not learn it directly. She learned it the way she learned most things in this house, obliquely, from the accumulation of small evidence, confirmed eventually by something overheard that she had not intended to hear. She was in the upper hall with the floor wax and the lamb's wool buffer, one of the less interesting tasks but one that needed doing, and she was working methodically along the boards when she heard the Duke and Mrs. Aldred in the room beyond. The door was not fully closed. She was not eavesdropping. She heard enough to understand the context and then concentrated on the floorboards and heard no more than was unavoidable. They were discussing the east room, the one with the portrait facing the wall. Mrs. Aldred was saying in her quiet, practical way that the room needed attention, that the damp was getting into the plaster on the north wall, that the painting would need to come down eventually and the wall treated or it would be ruined. The Duke said, and she heard this clearly because the house was quiet and his voice carried, "Leave it." Mrs. Aldred said, equally clearly, "Edmund." A pause. It was the first time Elspeth had heard anyone use his first name. Then the Duke said, "Not yet, leave it a little longer." And Mrs. Aldred said nothing in response, which was, Elspeth had learned, Mrs. Aldred's way of saying that she understood, and that she agreed to wait, and that she was sorry. Elspeth worked the wax into the boards with steady, even circles. She understood now the painting facing the wall. She understood now the worn places in the house, the banister, the kitchen table, the garden bench space. She understood why the east wing had been given to the dog, why the house held its past in it, the way a sealed room holds its smell. She understood why a man who had been happy once might build himself a life that was efficient and well managed, and contained no more than it needed to, and why a dog who had known him through both versions of himself might choose to spend his time somewhere else. That evening, Elspeth Voss sat in her room with the lamp and the history of the county, and she did not read. She sat and thought about houses and what they were when the people in them were not yet finished with what had happened to them, and she thought about the careful man she saw in doorways and corridors, and she thought about Gormel, who had chosen her on the first morning and had not revised that choice, and she thought about what it meant to be chosen by something that had very good judgment and very high standards. She thought about the fire, her fire, not his, the house in the north, the man who owned it, the inquest that had found nothing to find because the people asked had not been asked the right questions. She thought about 11 months in the north with nothing but what she had started with, which was competence and steadiness, and the quality of presence that animals recognized before people did. She had not been chosen by anything for a long time. She sat with this thought very carefully because she was a careful person and because things decided quickly had cost her before. Not this exactly, but the neighboring things, the family of things that this was related to. She put the lamp out and lay in the dark, and outside in the east passage Gormel settled on his sheepskin, and somewhere in the locked east room a painting faced its wall and waited, and the house breathed around all of them in the dark. On the last Friday of the 8th week, the Duke sent for her. It was Percy who delivered the message, with a face that showed nothing because Percy had learned, after 3 years in this house, how to show nothing on his face as a professional requirement. He said that the Duke requested Elspeth to attend him at the study at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Elspeth said thank you and went back to what she was doing, which was rehanging the east corridor curtains that had been down for a wash. Lottie found her an hour later and wanted to know what she thought it was about, and Elspeth said she didn't know, and Lottie wanted to know if she was worried, and Elspeth said no, and Lottie was not fully convinced by this but had nothing to push against, so she went away. At 5 minutes to 3, Elspeth put away the curtain hooks and washed her hands and checked her apron and went to the study. The door was open. She knocked on the frame. Edmund Ashver looked up from his desk. "Come in," he said. She came in and stood in the way you stand in a room where you have been called, not at the door, not pressing forward in the clear middle space that said, "I am here and I'm listening." He looked at her for a moment, then he looked at the desk. "I have a question," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that it has no bearing on your position here. Whatever you tell me, your place at Blackmore Hall is not in question." She said nothing because nothing was needed yet. "The letter of character from your previous household." He did not look at the letter, he looked at her. "The date on the letterhead is 11 months before the date of writing. I noticed this when you arrived and I have been sitting with it since. I am asking you about it now not to investigate you, and not because I have any suspicion of wrongdoing on your part. I'm asking because I believe you deserve to be asked directly rather than looked into behind your back." Elspeth stood in the middle of the room. She had wondered since the first week when he would ask. She had watched him discover it in the timing she had deduced. A man like this did not miss that kind of detail, but a man like this also did not act without thinking, and thinking took time. She had prepared in the quiet of her evenings a version of what she would say. It was truthful, it was complete, it was the minimum necessary. She said, "The household let me go before anyone thought to write a letter. It was 8 months before someone who had been there wrote it for me. The household was not well run at the end. The man who owned it was not a good employer. There was a fire, I left before it. The letter was an afterthought from someone who had been kind enough to remember." She did not elaborate. She had promised herself long ago that she would not elaborate. The elaborations were where the sympathy went wrong, where it became something she needed to manage, which was worse than having said nothing. The Duke looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Are you safe now?" She was quiet for a beat, because it was so precisely the right question, and it had been so long since anyone had asked exactly the right question, that she needed a moment for it to land. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "Good," he said, and then, as though there were nothing more to say about it, and indeed there was not, he said, "Thank you, that's all." She went back to the curtains and hung them and did not cry because she was not on the whole a person who cried. But she pressed her forehead against the cool stone of the east corridor wall for one moment, just one, and breathed, and let herself feel the solidity of the stone, and then she straightened up and finished the job. Callum Ashfur arrived on a Wednesday in the 9th week, and the house knew before he came through the door. Animals feel it first, and Gormal confirmed what the weather had been threatening all morning. The dog was on his feet before the sound of the carriage reached the servants' ears, standing in the east passage with his head raised and his attention fixed on the south end of the house. Not alarmed, alert, the specific alertness of a creature that knows a thing it does not like is incoming. Percy heard the wheels on the gravel and went to open the front door, and Mrs. Aldred appeared from somewhere with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been preparing. And Elspeth, who was in the east corridor with the beeswax and the window frames, heard the sound of someone arriving and felt, without knowing why, the particular tension that comes into a house when its equilibrium is about to be disturbed. Lord Callum Ashfur was 41, 3 years older than his brother, and he looked it in the way that certain men look their age, not in the face, which was still handsome in the expected way, but in the manner. He had the bearing of a man who had decided early what the world was and had found on balance that he had been right. He moved through space as though it had been arranged for him, which it generally had been, because he was the kind of man that people arranged space for before he asked. He did not have his brother's quietness. He was not loud, exactly nothing as simple as that, but he filled rooms differently. Where Edmund withdrew into himself, giving the room back to anyone else who wanted it, Callum simply occupied with the thoroughness of a man who has never noticed that rooms have a capacity. He came in with 2 trunks and a London valet named George, and he greeted Mrs. Aldred with the brisk warmth of a man who remembers the names of senior household staff as a management principle, and he went to find his brother. Percy, watching from the hall, said nothing. He went to find Elspeth. "He's come for money," Lottie said at the servants' table that night, with the directness of someone who had heard this particular visit discussed before. "He always comes for money. Last time he came it was about the Yorkshire estate. The time before that it was some investment that hadn't gone as planned." "Does he come often?" Elspeth asked. "Often enough, every 8 months or so. He and the Duke don't," Lottie considered her words. "They're not close, but they're family, so he comes." Ned was cutting his bread. "He doesn't like Gormal." "Nobody likes Gormal," Percy said. "I meant," Ned set down his knife, "he especially doesn't like Gormal. Last time he was here, the dog sat in the doorway of the yellow room for 2 hours while Lord Callum was trying to get past it to his bedroom, and Lord Callum had to go around through the back corridor, and he was in a terrible temper about it, and he told the Duke that the animal needed to be controlled." "What did the Duke say?" Elspeth asked. Ned looked at her with a brief, considering expression. "He said, Gormal makes his own decisions about doorways." A short silence. "Which is not," Percy said carefully, "how you manage a situation like that." "No," Ned agreed, "but it's what he said." Elspeth was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about a man who said, Gormal makes his own decisions about doorways, about what it meant to be that kind of person. To refuse to apologize for a creature in your care, not because you were careless or proud, but because you had made a commitment and you kept it. "Has he asked about me?" she said. A pause, then Percy said, "Not directly, but George was asking Lottie questions in the kitchen this afternoon." Elspeth looked at Lottie. Lottie set down her fork. "He wanted to know how long you'd been here, how you'd come to the position, whether you had family in the area." She looked a little uncomfortable. "I told him you'd come in the normal way through the paper and that you had no family here that I knew of. That was all I said." "That's fine," Elspeth said. "You told the truth." "He had a way of asking that felt like he already thought he knew the answer," Lottie said. "Like the questions were just confirmation, not actual questions." Elspeth nodded and finished her supper, and the table moved on to other topics, and she said nothing more about it. But she sat with it in the quiet part of herself, the part that watched things and considered them without hurrying, and she was aware, for the first time since arriving at the hall, of a specific kind of unease. Not fear, something more like recognition. The recognition of a particular type of attention, the kind that goes looking for something it has already decided it will find. The first encounter between Elspeth and Callum happened on the Thursday morning. She was on the main stairs with a cloth and a pail, working her way down the banister rail, when she heard him come out of the dining room. She was near the bottom of the stairs, and he would have had to go well out of his way not to pass her. He did not go well out of his way. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked up at her in the considering way that he apparently looked at everything, and said, "You're the new maid." "Yes, sir," she said. "How long have you been here?" 9 weeks. "And where before this?" She finished the section of rail she was working on and moved the cloth to the next. "The north, sir." He waited, and she understood that he was waiting for the name of the household. She did not provide it. "You've made quite an impression," he said, with the tone of a man who is complimenting someone and not fully meaning it as a compliment. "The dog apparently follows you everywhere." "He's comfortable with me," she said. "I'm in the East Wing a great deal." "More than comfortable, from what I've been told. George tells me he saw the animal lying across your doorstep last evening." She looked at the banister. "I understand you're quiet about your previous employment," Callum said. She looked at him then, directly, briefly. "I'm not quiet about it," she said. "I simply don't volunteer it in casual conversation." There was a moment in which he recalibrated slightly. She had spoken more directly than he had expected. "Quite right," he said, with the smoothness of a man who is never successfully surprised for long. "Quite right, I was only making conversation." "You seem very capable." "Thank you, sir." He went on past her, and she went on with the banister, and she did not look after him. But her hands on the cloth were more careful than usual for the rest of that rail. Callum found his brother in the estate office on Friday morning. The Duke was at the long table with the maps and the land records, which was where he usually was on Friday mornings, working through the estate management with the thoroughness that he applied to everything. He looked up when Callum came in and said nothing, which was how Edmund Ashford said hello. "The estate looks well," Callum said, dropping into the chair across the table with the comfort of someone in his own space. "It is well. The North Fields were showing some where last time I was here. Those were sorted. Last autumn, Perrin has good judgment about drainage." Callum nodded, and they went through the estate matters efficiently, because whatever the complications of their relationship, they were both practical men, and practical matters were the easy part of their conversations. Then Callum said without transition, "The maid." Edmund did not look up from the map he was folding. "Elspeth Voss." "Yes," a pause. "You're aware she's careful about her previous situation." "I'm aware of her previous situation." A short silence. Callum recalibrated. "You've looked into it." "I asked her directly." Callum looked at his brother across the table, and she answered directly, and I was satisfied with the answer. "Edmund," Callum leaned forward slightly. "I'm not suggesting anything unpleasant. I simply think it's unusual that an otherwise perfectly competent woman is deliberately vague about where she came from. And I think it's more unusual still that Gormel, who has spent 4 years making this house largely inaccessible, is now, what is the word, devoted to her." "Loyal," Edmund said. "Loyal to a woman who has been here 9 weeks. The Duke set down the map. He looked at his brother with the expression he used for things he had already decided and was about to say once. "Gormel has spent 4 years here, as you say, and in that time he has made it clear that his judgment about people is more reliable than most human judgments I have encountered. He decided about Elspeth Voss on her first morning. He has not revised that decision. I find that more informative than anything your man George can discover through the kitchen." Callum was quiet. "She works well," Edmund continued. "She is honest, she is decent, she asks nothing from this house except what she has earned, and she is under my roof, which means she is not a subject for your investigation." The word sat between them. "I'm not investigating her," Callum said carefully. "Good." Another pause. Then Callum said, with the slight edge of a man who has been closed out of a topic and is not fully resigned to it, "George has contacts in the north. He says there was a house." Callum. The word landed flat and firm, the way Edmund's words landed when he was done. Callum sat back. He was a man who knew when to stop, even if he did not always want to stop. He picked up the county map from the edge of the table and studied it without seeing it, and after a moment said, "How are the western fences holding?" They returned to the estate. But the conversation stayed with Edmund afterward, sitting in him like a stone in still water, not agitating anything, but present, settled, undeniably there. Callum had contacts in the north. Callum would use them because Callum did not know how to leave things alone that he had decided were his business. Edmund put the maps away and sat at the desk, and thought about what it meant that his brother was going to go looking, and what it meant that Edmund had already decided it did not matter what he found. Gormel met Callum in the hall on Friday afternoon. It was the first time they had been in the same space since Callum's arrival, partly because Callum had been careful about it, and partly because the house was large enough to manage that. But the hall was unavoidable, and Callum came through it from the front door at 3 in the afternoon, just as Gormel was crossing it from the east passage. They stopped. Gormel looked at Callum. Then he looked away, with the total, considered, deliberate dismissal of a creature that has assessed something and found it beneath its concern, and continued across the hall and out the other side. Callum stood in the hall for a moment. Percy, who happened to be at the far end of the room and had seen this, found a reason to be elsewhere very quickly. He was good at not being seen to witness things. Later at the servants' supper he said to Ned in an undertone, he didn't even growl. Ned considered this, is that better or worse? Percy thought about it. I think it's worse, he said finally. A growl means you're worth warning, not looking means you're not worth the energy. Ned nodded slowly. Gormel doesn't like him. Gormel knows something, Percy said. They ate their supper. In the east wing, Elspeth brushed Sixpence the cat and watched Gormel's ears, and thought about the stone that had been sitting in her since the Thursday morning stairs, and thought about what a person did when something they had built carefully, slowly, from nothing, was being looked at from the outside by someone who had decided what they were going to find. She brushed the cat and breathed steadily, and Gormel's ears were easy, and the fire in the grate put out its yellow light, and she let herself be here in this room in this house for this hour. She had learned in the years since the fire to live very specifically in the present, because the past and the future were both unreliable landscapes, and the present was the only ground that held. Here was solid. She held on to that. What Callum's man George found took 4 days. It was not a dramatic discovery. It was a quiet one, which in some ways made it harder to argue with, because it did not come with a clear shape. It was more like a smell than a fact, the smell of something that had happened in a room you could no longer enter because the room was gone. George was efficient and thorough, and had, over many years of working for Callum Ashford, developed a useful network of contacts in legal offices, domestic registries, and the kind of establishments that kept records of things people would rather forget. He sent 2 letters north on Thursday and received 1 reply by Sunday, which was fast, and the reply contained what he needed. He brought it to Callum on Sunday evening, and Callum read it at the writing desk in the yellow room with the lamp pulled close. The house in the north had been owned by a man named Orton Beauclair, a landowner well regarded in business, a member of 2 county clubs and a subscriber to several respectable causes. He had died in a fire 4 years ago. The fire had started in his study. The inquest had found no evidence of deliberate cause. Death by misadventure, the record said, which was the category used for bad things that happen at night to people who are careless. The household staff had scattered after the fire. Most had gone to other positions in the county. One had gone north to a different county altogether. One had come south eventually to a position on a moorland estate. That was the whole of it. Callum read it twice, then he set it on the desk and sat with it. He was not a man who was easily troubled by unpleasant conclusions. He was practical, and practical people understood that the world contained unpleasant things that had happened, and that the living mostly survived them and continued. He had not come here with the intention of finding something damning. He had come, as he told himself, with an interest in his brother's welfare and a concern about the unusual situation at Blackmore Hall. But the document in front of him had a certain weight to it that was harder to sit with than he had expected. What he was holding was not evidence. He was clear-eyed enough to know that. A fire, an inquest, a maid who had eventually left the county, none of that was evidence of anything. Evidence had requirements, witnesses, documentation, causal chains. This had none of those things. This was a set of facts that, arranged in a certain order and read with a certain suspicion, told a story. But facts arranged differently or read without suspicion told nothing at all. He sat with the document for a long time, then he went to find his brother. Edmund was in the library. He was not reading. He was sitting in the chair by the window with a glass of something and looking out at the dark moors, which was what he did when he was thinking and did not want to think in his study where the desk imposed its own agenda. Gormel was on the floor near the fireplace, which was unusual in itself. The dog rarely came into the library, and when he did, he rarely stayed. But he was there now, facing the door, with the specific alertness of an animal that knows something is coming. Callum came through the door and Gormel did not move. He looked at Callum and then looked at Edmund and then looked at Callum again, and the amber eyes were steady. Edmund said nothing, he waited. Callum sat in the other chair and put the document on the arm of it. George found some records. Edmund looked at him. The house in the north, Callum said. Orton Beauclair, he died in a fire, his housekeeper left afterward. A number of the staff did, one came here. The library was very quiet. Edmund said, "What would you have me do with this?" Callum was quiet for a moment. "I thought you would want to know." "I see," Edmund looked at the window. "You thought I would want to know that a woman who has been in my employment for 10 weeks, and who works honestly and well, and who has done nothing except her job and be a decent person, I would want to know that something bad happened in a house she used to work in." "Something bad may have." Callum, Edmund's voice was not raised. It was very quiet, which was always in Edmund Ashford more significant than raised. "A man died in a fire. The inquest found no evidence of wrongdoing. That is what the record says. That is the totality of what the record says. Everything else that you are thinking about that record is a story you have built around it, and you have built it around Elspeth Voss, and I am telling you now that you will not continue to build it." Callum said after a pause, "You've already decided." "I decided weeks ago. I asked her about her previous situation. She answered me honestly. Whatever you know about that house, I know the shape of what happened there, and I am satisfied with my understanding of it, and I will not be telling you more than that because it is not mine to tell." "Edmund, she is in my house." The quiet was absolute now. "She is under my protection, and you will leave this alone." Gormel, from the hearth rug, had not taken his eyes off Callum. Not threatening, not shifting, just watching, with the concentrated attention of an animal that has aligned itself with a position, and is waiting to see if the position will hold. Callum looked at the document on the arm of his chair. Then he looked at his brother. He was a man who argued well and long when he thought he was right, and there were a great many topics on which he and Edmund had argued across tables and across years. But he had also, in those years, learned to read the specific version of his brother that was not arguing, the version that had already closed the door and was standing on the other side of it. He picked up the document and folded it and said, "All right." "Thank you," Edmund said. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Callum said something about the western fences and they talked about the estate for half an hour, and then Callum went to bed, and Edmund sat in the library for another hour with the dark window and the sleeping dog. Elspeth did not know what had happened in the library until 3 days later. She knew that something had happened. You could feel it in the atmosphere of the house, the particular quality of a thing that had been contested and resolved. Callum had a different manner on Monday, not changed exactly but adjusted. The watchfulness in his attention when he looked at her was muted, as though someone had turned it down. He spoke to her once, in the passage, with a perfectly civil inquiry about the morning weather, and she responded with equal civility, and neither of them said anything about anything else. She did not ask. She was not going to ask. She had learned very early that things you did not need to know were safer left alone, and that knowing something gave you a responsibility to it that you might not be ready for. But she was aware. She noticed the shift and she held it as a question she was not asking, and she let it sit. On Wednesday, Percy told her, not in the gossiping way, but in the careful way he had of passing along things he thought she needed to know as a professional courtesy, that Lord Callum had apparently looked into her previous situation and had spoken to the Duke about it. She stopped walking when he said this. She was in the corridor near the linen room and she stopped and stood still. "What did the Duke say?" she asked. Percy met her eyes. "What I heard, and I didn't hear much, was that he told Lord Callum it wasn't his concern and that she was under his protection." He paused, "That she being you." She stood for a moment. "I thought you should know," Percy said. "Even if nothing comes of it, I thought you should know what was said." "Yes," she said. "Thank you." She went to the linen room and stood inside it with the door not quite closed, in the quiet and the smell of clean cloth, and she held herself very still for a long moment, not distressed, not, she checked, afraid, something else. Something she had to be careful with because it was large and she was not used to it and she had to understand it before she let it in. She had been protected before, or a version of protection. The kind that came with obligation attached, the kind that required something of you in return. That was not protection. That was transaction dressed in the clothes of protection. What Edmund Ashfur had apparently said in that library, she was under his protection, and the subject was closed, had not, as far as she could understand it, required her to be anything except herself. She stood in the linen room and breathed, and let the large feeling happen carefully, and after a while went back to her work. Callum left on the Friday. He left with his trunks and his valet in a manner that was, outwardly, perfectly usual. He said his goodbyes to Mrs. Aldred and to his brother, gave a reasonable amount of notice to the staff in the hall, and departed in his carriage back to Edinburgh and his own complicated life. Gormall watched him go from the east corridor window. He stood at the window until the carriage was out of sight, and then he turned and walked back to his platform and lay down, and the east corridor settled. Elspeth was in the garden when the carriage went. She did not watch it go. She was tying the pea runners to their canes, which needed doing, and she did it with her full attention, and when she came back into the kitchen Lottie said, "He's gone," and Elspeth said, "Good. Is the bread ready?" And Lottie laughed with relief she hadn't known she was holding. "Just about," Lottie said. "Good." Elspeth hung up her garden apron and washed her hands. "I'm very hungry." Edmund Ashfur did not go looking for her afterward. That was not his way. He did not go to the East Wing specifically, or to wherever she was, for any reason that was about what had happened with Callum. He went about his week in the way he went about weeks, the accounts, the estate manager, the parish meeting on Thursday, the post on Wednesday mornings. But on the Thursday afternoon he found himself in the East Corridor. He was not going to the East Corridor. He was going to the back stairs, which happened to be at the end of the East Corridor, and the route was reasonable. She was in the East Corridor, refinishing the window frames with the new linseed oil that Perrin had brought from the village. The smell of it filled the passage, good and organic, the smell of wood being taken care of. Gormall was on his platform. Edmund stopped at the end of the corridor. She looked up. He was struck, as he had been struck before and more so now, by the quality of her attention. She was not performing anything. She was not calculating anything. She was simply looking at him in the way of a person who is present and waiting to see what is needed. He said, "I wanted you to know that what was discussed last week." He paused, finding the right boundary of what to say. "Nothing that came up will have any effect on your position here or on anything else. I wanted to say that to you directly." She held his gaze for a moment. "Percy told me something of what was said," she said. "Thank you for the way you handled it." He nodded. He was not a man who received gratitude with ease. He looked at the window frame she had been working on. The linseed oil, good choice. The east frames have needed that for 2 years. "The wood's been dry," she said. "Another winter and the joints would have started failing." They would have. He looked at the window. She looked at the window. Gormall, on his platform, looked at neither of them with the air of an animal too dignified to be observed watching a human interaction. "Sixpence is getting fat," Edmund said, which was not what he had planned to say but was what came out. Something moved in her face, not quite a smile, the early vicinity of one. "She is," Elspeth agreed. "She's eating very well. She'll have to work for it eventually. There are mice in the grain store. I'll tell her she's a practical cat. She'll understand." He looked at her then fully, briefly, the way you look when you have decided to look and have given yourself permission. She was watching him with that quality of attention that the dog had, the quality of genuine, uncurated presence, the quality of something that has looked at you and found you, and is not pretending otherwise. He said good evening then, and went on to the back stairs. Behind him in the East Corridor, the smell of linseed oil and the sound of her brush on the wood. He went down the back stairs and through the kitchen passage, and out the south door into the evening, and he stood on the gravel for a moment in the fresh air, and he thought about what it meant to be seen by someone who was not trying to see you for any reason except that they were paying attention. He had not been seen like that in a long time. He went back inside and did his accounts, and the house settled around him, and the evening went on, and he was, in some way he was not going to examine tonight, less alone than he had been in the morning. May came to the moors in full and final earnest, and the estate unfurled like something that had been waiting. The birch trees along the north wall went from pale suggestion to full leaf in the space of a week. The kitchen garden stopped being a set of bare rows and became, seemingly overnight, a place of organized abundance. The birds came back to the eaves of the east wing and built their nests in the mortar cracks with the efficient opportunism of creatures who have been waiting for exactly this, and who knew when the moment was right. Elspeth noticed all of it. She had always been a person who noticed seasonal things, who paid attention to the moment a garden changed, who felt the quality of the air shift when warmth was returning, who could tell by the sound of the birds in the morning whether the weather would hold. Her father had been this way. It was a useful way to be if you spent time outdoors and cared about how things grew. Blackmore Hall, she discovered, was a different place in May than it had been in the weeks since she arrived. The stone that held cold all winter began to hold warmth instead. The windows that had been kept shut against the frost were now opened in the mornings. She opened them herself on her rounds, and the more air came in with the smell of heather and wet earth, which was a smell that required no response except to let it happen. Gormel was in good spirits in the way that dogs have spirits. He ranged further on his morning routes through the estate. She could tell from his arrival times at the various rooms where she worked. When he was in his winter pattern, he came early from short ranges. When the weather opened, he extended his mornings, came later, arrived at the east window when the sun was already well up, with wet paws and the specific smell of a dog that has been in heather, and settled in with the complete satisfaction of an animal that has used the morning well. She mentioned this to Edmund one morning. She had not made a habit of mentioning things to him. She had made a habit of working and being present and not volunteering more than was asked. But it was becoming clear to her, in these weeks since the Callum business, that something had shifted between them in a way that she was not going to name, but also could not pretend had not shifted. He had come to the east corridor in the morning for the third time that week, not pretending to have a reason anymore. Not routing through it on the way to something else. He came, and he stood near the window, and sometimes they said things and sometimes they did not. That morning she said, "He comes back with wet paws, he's been in the lower heather." Edmund looked at Gormel, who was on the platform with his damp front paws tucked under him, looking unconcerned about the scrutiny. He always went down there in spring, before. She did not ask what before meant. She had learned the particular quality of that word in this house. It meant the time before the thing that had changed the house, and it was not for her to ask about, and she did not. But he said after a moment, "My wife liked the lower heather in spring. Gormel used to go with her." He said it in the even tone of someone who has decided to say a thing, and says it cleanly, without decoration, because decoration would make it harder. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He has good memories then of that walk." Edmund looked at the dog. "He does. That's why he goes." Perhaps he was quiet. "I think dogs don't separate memory from habit quite the way we do. It may be that for him it's simply where he goes in May, what he does, and she is part of why it feels right in the way that a season feels right, not grief, just association." Elspeth thought about this. That's a kinder account of it than most people would give. He looked at her briefly. Most people are not paying attention to dogs. The morning went on. The sun moved across the window. Gormel's wet paws dried, and after a while he stood and stretched in the extraordinary full-body way that large dogs stretch, and then walked to the door and looked at Elspeth. She looked back. "I believe that's my summons," she said. Edmund, who was leaning against the window frame with his arms crossed in the casual posture she had come to recognize as his least guarded one, said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'll be at the South Fields this afternoon. I don't require anything from the East Wing afternoon." She understood this as what it was, information arranged to set her at liberty for the afternoon if she wanted liberty. Not a request, not a condition, just a fact offered. "Thank you," she said. She went with Gormel, who had already started for the garden. The South Fields in May were not like the South Fields in any other month. They were high, exposed land where the grass was short and tough, and the wind came in long, steady waves that bent everything permanently in one direction, so that even on still days the grass looked like it was remembering the wind. Elspeth had not been to the South Fields before. She had not had a reason, and the South Fields were not part of her ordinary range. But the afternoon was open, and Gormel had led her, and she had followed because he had been right about the garden shed and right about sixpence, and she had developed a working confidence in his judgment about where to go. She stood at the top of the south field and looked at the moors. They went a very long way. She had grown up in the north and was used to open country, but the particular quality of the moors, the way they absorbed the sky, the way distance was not a thing that ended anywhere but simply continued until it became something else, was different from what she knew. It was older somehow, more settled into itself. Gormall was somewhere below her in the heather, audible as a presence in the stems rather than visible. She could follow his location by the movement, the slight sway of the heather ahead of him as he moved through it, the way it closed again behind. She sat down on the grass at the top of the field and put her arms around her knees and looked at the distance, and she thought about being here, the specific fact of being here. Not a thought that went anywhere, just the present inventory, this hill, this wind, this dog invisible below her in the heather, this sky, this evening coming in from the east. She had been at Blackmore Hall for 2.5 months. That was the thought that stopped her, 2.5 months, which was not long, which was much shorter than the previous position, which had been nearly 3 years, a long time to be somewhere, too long perhaps, and yet she had stayed because she had not known for a long time that she should leave. She had not known for a long time that staying was the same as choosing to stay, and that she had a choice. She had a choice now, she knew that. She had known it every morning when she woke up in the plain room with the window over the kitchen garden, and she had chosen each morning to stay, not from inertia, not from necessity, because this was a house where Gormall lay at her door and Lottie made her cups of tea and Mrs. Aldred treated her with the respect of someone who has assessed a worker and found her competent, and because there was a man who kept a letter in his desk drawer and said, "She is under my protection and the subject is closed." Not because she needed protecting, she had managed without it, she was very good at managing without it. But the word meant something different when it was offered freely, without agenda, when it was given not as a cage but as a statement, as a position taken. She sat on the south field and thought about the specific version of solitude she had been living in for 4 years, solitude that was not lonely, exactly, but that was very much alone. And she thought about what it felt like to be in a house where she was, increasingly, not alone. The heather moved. Gormall emerged from it 20 feet down the slope, damp and purposeful, and came up to where she was sitting. He stood beside her and looked at the moors. She put her hand on his back without thinking about it. He was warm under her hand, very large, very solid. He did not move. They sat there together for a while, the woman and the dog, on the top of the south field with the evening coming in from the east, and it was quiet, and it was not lonely at all. Edmund found the book missing on a Tuesday. He had gone to the study bookshelf to retrieve a volume on estate law and found 2 spaces from it on the shelf, a gap where another book should have been. He stood at the shelf for a moment, scanning. He had a good memory for the arrangement of his books, which were sorted in a system that made sense to him and to no one else. The gap was where the natural history of the Irish Wolfhound had been. He stood at the shelf. He had put the book back after the night he had taken it down, after the night Gormall had come home from County Clare, and he had read the breed history because he had committed to an animal he did not fully understand, and he believed in understanding what he committed to. He had read it carefully, marking the passages he found useful. He had put it back on the shelf afterward and had not taken it down again. Someone had taken it down. He went through the house mentally, who had access to the study, which was not a locked room but was, by convention, a room that the household entered to clean and otherwise left alone. Mrs. Aldred occasionally, Percy for certain cleaning tasks, no one else on a regular basis. He was aware, as he stood at the shelf, that the conclusion he was reaching might not be the conclusion. But the conclusion he was reaching was that the book had been taken down, and had been read, or was being read, and then put back, except that the putting back had not happened yet. He did not say anything to anyone. He went to his desk and did his work. 2 days later the book was back on the shelf. He noticed it the same way he had noticed its absence, a small attention, a mental note filed and then recovered. He went to the shelf and took the book down and looked at it. It was as he had left it, with his pencil marks in the margins. But when he fanned the pages slowly, the pages fell open with the ease of something that had been recently, repeatedly consulted. The way a book opens at the places that have been read most recently. He turned to the page where the book wanted to fall open. It was the section on the breed's nature. The paragraph about loyalty was there, with his 3 margin lines beside it. Below it, a paragraph that he had not marked about the breed's characteristic. Their tendency to choose one person, specifically not a household, not a family in the general sense, but an individual, and to align themselves with that individual with a constancy that other breeds would call stubbornness, but which in the Irish Wolfhound was better understood as a form of fidelity that came from something older and deeper than training. He stood at the desk and read this paragraph. Then he put the book back on the shelf in its place and went to the window. He thought about Elspeth Voss reading this book, reading it in the evenings, probably in her room, in the way she read everything, carefully, with her full attention, not performing understanding but reaching for it. Reading about the dog that had chosen her, trying to understand what she had been chosen for. That was a careful person, a person who took seriously the things that happened to them and tried to understand them rather than simply accepting or rejecting them. He looked out the window at the moors. He was a careful person too. He thought about what it meant that they were both, separately, reading the same book. He put the window latch down because the evening was cooling and went to the kitchen to get the dog's dinner, which was a task he had always done himself, because there were some things you did not delegate to other people when they were the things that mattered. June arrived, and with it a change in the daily rhythm of Blackmore Hall that was gradual, and then, looking back, seemed to have happened all at once. The way the light changes at midsummer, you don't notice it going until one evening you look up and realize the sky is still bright at 8:30, and you don't know quite when that started. What changed was this: Edmund Ashfur began to take his morning tea in the East Corridor. It began, as far as Elspeth could trace it, as a coincidence. Or not a coincidence exactly. He had been coming to the East Corridor in the mornings for weeks, and he drank tea in the mornings because everyone drank tea in the mornings, and the two facts had simply eventually coincided. He had come to the East Corridor with the cup still in his hand, and had stood at the window while she worked and Gormel occupied the platform, and it had felt, in the doing of it, like a thing that had been arranged. He came back the next morning and the next. Nobody in the household remarked on it to anyone, which was itself a kind of remark. The staff of Blackmore Hall had, across the weeks, developed a collective understanding of what was happening that they communicated through glances and silences, and the specific studied non-attentiveness of people who are paying very close attention while pretending not to. Lottie knew, Percy knew, Mrs. Aldred knew before all of them, and had known in the way she knew things, which was before she could have said how she knew. None of them said anything to anyone. This was, in its way, the most eloquent response available to them. The conversations grew. Not dramatically, not in long or effusive ways, in the incremental accumulation of the sort of talk that two careful people build between them, specific, concrete, often about the house or the estate or the dog or the cat, which were the safe currencies that both of them understood were carrying other things. He told her about the history of the East Wing. She listened with the full attention he had come to rely on, not the performed attention of someone waiting to respond, but the real thing, the attention that sits with what it hears. She told him about the kitchen garden and what it needed. She had been in it enough by now to understand it well, and he listened in turn and asked questions that suggested he was thinking about it rather than simply waiting for her to finish. She said one morning that the pea runners needed more canes, and that the canes in the garden store were not adequate. He said, "What kind would you want?" She said, "The split hazel is best. There's a hazel row in the north field." He said, "I'll ask Perrin." The next day the canes were there. That was the rhythm, practical, specific, unadorned. But underneath it, and she felt it, and believed he felt it too, though neither of them was the kind of person who narrated their feelings aloud while they were happening, was something that had weight. The weight of two people who had decided, without saying so, to be present for each other in this small daily space, to show up at the East Corridor window with tea and be here. Gormel, for his part, occupied the platform with the quiet self-satisfaction of a creature whose plan has been developing exactly as planned, which was perhaps not what was happening at all, but which was the interpretation that Ned the stable lad put forward at the Friday supper, and which received more nodding than it might have expected. The crisis, when it came out of nowhere. Or not out of nowhere. Crises never come from nowhere. They come from places that have been building, and the building is just not always visible until something tips. It was a Wednesday morning in late June, and it began with a letter. The Morning Post came to the hall as it always did, sorted by Mrs. Aldred and distributed to the study for Edmund and the kitchen for the domestic communications. On this Wednesday, there was a letter among the domestic correspondence addressed to Elspeth Voss, not to the household, to her specifically. Mrs. Aldred brought it to her in the east corridor. Elspeth was on the platform step with Gormel's brush, doing the weekly grooming that she had taken over without discussion 2 months ago, and that Gormel submitted to with the grudging cooperation of a very dignified creature who did not particularly want to be brushed, but had accepted that this was the arrangement. She looked at the letter. The hand on the front was not one she recognized. The postmark was from the north. She took the letter and thanked Mrs. Aldred and did not open it until she was alone. Mrs. Aldred, who understood this without being told, went about her business. Gormel watched her hold the letter. She turned it over once. The seal was a plain wax disc, no impression. She ran her thumb along the edge. Gormel put his head under her arm. This was something he did, she had learned, when he was offering a specific kind of companionship, not asking for attention, but providing it. The weight of his large head against her side was a warm, definite thing. She opened the letter. It was from the wife of the solicitor who had handled the Beauclair estate after the fire. A woman named Grace Fenwick, who had been, Elspeth recalled, a kind-looking woman she had met once at an inquest waiting room. She had not known her. She did not know why she was writing now. The letter explained itself in the 3rd paragraph. A remaining question had come up in the settlement of the Beauclair estate. A question about the fire, specifically about the origin of the fire, which the original inquest had ruled accidental, but about which new information had recently emerged. An investigator had been engaged by the estate's legal inheritors to review the matter. Grace Fenwick, whose husband had records of the original settlement, had been contacted. In the course of reviewing those records, Elspeth's name had come up. She had been listed as a member of the household, and the investigator wished to speak with her if she was willing. Nothing in the letter accused her of anything. Nothing in the letter suggested she was in any difficulty. It was, outwardly, a reasonable communication from a reasonable person about a legal matter. But it was from the north. It was about that house. It was about a fire that the inquest had called accidental, and which the letter now said had new information surrounding it. She sat for a moment. Then she folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket, and picked up the brush again and said to Gormel, who was still with his head against her side, "I know." She was quiet for the rest of the morning. She told Edmund at noon. She had decided to tell him before she had consciously made the decision. The decision had been made somewhere below the level of deliberation, by some part of her that had been paying attention to what kind of person he was, and had concluded that he deserved to know before he heard it from somewhere else. She found him in the estate office, where he was with the land records. She knocked and came in when he said to come in, and she stood in the office, in the same middle space she had stood in the first time she was summoned here, and she said, "I've had a letter, from the north, about the fire." He put down his pencil. She told him the whole of it, not just the letter's contents, the whole of it. What she had told him the first time briefly, and at minimum she now told him fully, not everything. Some things were hers and no one else's, and she kept them. But the shape of it, the real shape, Orton Beauclair, his habits, his treatment of his household, the night she had left, the fire she had not started but had not been present to stop, the inquest she had not attended because she was already gone, the 11 months in the north before someone she'd trusted wrote a letter for her. She told him clearly, without decoration, without asking for anything. He listened without interruption. He did not move. He held the quality of attention that she associated with him at his best, the full, undefended attention of someone who is receiving what is being given to him and not sorting it into categories while it arrives. When she was done, she said, "I am telling you this because you have a right to know what is under your roof, and because if this investigation becomes something public, I would rather you heard it from me." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What do you want to do?" She blinked briefly. "I want to cooperate with the investigation. I have nothing to hide. The truth of what that house was, if it comes out, is something I have wanted to come out for 4 years. Then we will cooperate with the investigation." She noted the way. She held it for a moment. "I may need to go north," she said. "Not for long, a week perhaps. When you need to go, you will go. Your position here waits for you. Your room is yours, this isn't a question. She looked at him, he looked at her. There was something in his face that she had been watching come closer, gradually, across the weeks, something that was still contained but was not as far behind the surface as it had been at the beginning, not yet visible enough to name, but present. "Thank you," she said. She went back to the east corridor and stood at the window and looked at the moors, which were very green and very far away, and she thought about the fact that something she had carried alone for 4 years was, for the first time, not entirely hers alone. Gormel came and stood beside her at the window. She put her hand on his back. He leaned into it slightly, in the easy way of an animal that has been doing this for a while and has decided it is a thing he does. "Oui," she said quietly. Gormel's tail moved once slow, like something being confirmed. She went north on a Friday morning at the end of June, in the early coach before the household was fully awake. She had packed the night before, the same single bag she had arrived with, and she had said goodbye to Lottie in the kitchen at 4:30, and to Percy in the corridor, and to Mrs. Aldred at the servant's door, who had given her an envelope with her wages to date and 2 extra weeks besides, which was not Mrs. Aldred's decision alone to make, and which Elspeth understood as such. She had gone to the east corridor last, as she always did. Gormel was awake. He was standing, which he did now when she arrived, not in the old alert stance of an animal assessing a potential threat, but in the standing of greeting, of expectation, of a creature that has organized its morning around the arrival of a particular person. He stood and watched her come into the passage. She crouched down in front of him, not a usual thing, she had not done this before, but it was not a usual morning, and she put both hands on the sides of his great head and held it and looked at him. He looked back. "I will come back," she said. "I want you to know that." He held very still under her hands. The amber eyes were, as they had always been, absolutely direct, not demanding, not anxious, just looking. "I'm not running," she said. "I stopped running a while ago. I'm going to go tell the truth about something, and then I'm coming back to the east corridor and the linseed oil and the kitchen garden and your appalling cat." The corner of something moved in the dim corridor. Sixpence, from her basket near the banked fire, looked at this description of herself with the mild offense of a creature that had not been consulted. Elspeth looked at the cat, then at the dog, and felt the absurdity and the realness of it simultaneously. This corridor, these animals, this house that had become, without her planning it, somewhere that felt like hers. She stood and picked up her bag. Edmund was at the corridor entrance. She had not heard him come. He was very quiet, and he was in the entrance just at the edge of the lamplight in his coat, which meant he had not been to bed or had not slept, and she looked at him for a moment. "The coach doesn't leave until 6, he said. "There's time for tea." She looked at him. "Come," he said. She followed him to the kitchen, where the range was lit for the morning and the first tea was already made, and they sat at the kitchen table, the long table with the deep score in the middle, and they drank tea in the dark of the early morning, before the household came, in the particular quiet of a house not yet awake. He asked her about the investigator, what she knew of the process, what she expected. She told him. She was precise and clear, as she was always precise and clear. He listened and asked practical questions, the kind of questions that helped rather than the kind that asked her to relive, and she answered them. Then they were quiet for a moment. He said, "Do you have what you need for the journey?" "Yes." "You will send word when you arrive." She looked at him. "Not a requirement," he said, in the way he had of adding that when he had asked something that he recognized had landed as a demand. "I would like to know you arrived safely." "I'll send word," she said. The morning moved around them. The first sounds from the upper house, a door, a distant footstep. Lottie would be back in the kitchen within the half-hour. Edmund looked at his cup, then he looked at her. He was a careful person who had spent a long time being careful, and who was now, she could see, at the edge of something he had been approaching for weeks. He said, "When you come back," he stopped. She waited. He said, "When you come back, I would like things to be different from how they have been." He was not looking at the cup anymore. He was looking at her with the full attention that was his most characteristic thing, the attention that gave itself entirely to what it was looking at. "I am not certain how to be specific about that yet. I want to be honest that I'm not certain. But I wanted to say it before you went so that you went knowing it." She held what he had said for a moment. She was careful with it, in the way she was careful with things that mattered. I know it, she said. I've known it for a while. She looked at the window. I've been careful too. I think that was right to be careful, but I think yes when I come back. He nodded. That was the shape of the agreement, not elaborate, not decorated. Just yes and when, and the morning going on around them. She finished her tea. She picked up her bag from the floor and stood, and he stood. She said, look after the cat. She'll bother you if I'm not there. She will not bother me, he said. She absolutely will. He looked at her with the expression she had come to know best, the one that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it, the one that lived in the vicinity of warmth. Go, you'll miss the coach. She went. The north was as she had left it, gray and wide and honest in the way that cold landscapes are honest, without ornamentation, without softening. She had not missed it, or not missed it in the simple way of longing, but there was a familiarity to it that was not nothing, the way you recognize a thing you grew up with even if you have no particular desire to return to it. The investigator was a man named Harwick, careful and systematic, with the manner of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and had learned to sit with difficulty without flinching. He asked her questions over the course of 3 days in the sitting room of the inn where she was staying, and she answered them completely. What she told him was this: Orton Beauclair had been a man who treated the people in his household as possessions. Not loudly, he was not a loud man. Quietly, in the way that is harder to document and harder to leave. She had stayed too long, as people stay too long when they do not know that leaving is an option, or when leaving requires resources they do not have, or when they are 17 and then 18 and then 19 and time passes and the arrangement becomes what existence is. She had left on a specific night. She had not started the fire. She had not been present when the fire began. She had been at that point 2 hours down the north road on foot with one bag and the coat on her back. The fire had started in his study. What had been in that study, and what Beauclair had been doing there on the night it burned, was what the investigation was asking. She answered what she knew. She did not know everything, she had not been there. But she knew enough, and she told it, and Harwick wrote it carefully in his records and thanked her. And on the 4th day she got on the southbound coach with her bag and went home. Home, the word had appeared in her thinking on the 2nd day in the north, and she had noted it and not argued with it. That was what it was. She arrived at Blackmore Hall on a Thursday afternoon, and she came through the servants' entrance with her bag, and before she had hung it up, sixpence was under her feet and Lottie was at the kitchen door and Percy was coming down the stairs saying she was back, she's back, and the hall reassembled itself around her in the easy way of a place that had been waiting. Gormel arrived last. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of his nails on the stone, coming fast, which was not his usual pace. He came around the corner of the east passage and stopped when he saw her. He stood there and looked at her. She looked back. Then he walked to her steadily, unhurried, because he was Gormel and he did not abandon his dignity even in moments of feeling, and put his head against her chest, which was the nearest thing to an embrace that an Irish wolfhound at full standing height could offer. She put her arms around his neck and held on for a moment, which she had not done before and which he received with the stillness of something that has been waiting for exactly this. I told you, she said quietly into the rough fur. I always come back. His tail moved slow and even like a metronome. She found Edmund that evening. Or he found her, she was not certain which direction the finding had gone, because they had come from different directions and met in the east corridor, which was where they seemed to meet when they were not arranged to meet anywhere else. He was at the window, she was coming down the passage. The fire was lit and the evening was long and golden in the way of late June, and the corridor had the specific quality it always had at this hour, the stone warm, the air easy, the world reduced to the length of a passage and the people in it. He said, "You're back." "I am." "How was it?" "Honest," she said. "Useful." She set her bag down. "I told the truth. I think it will do what truth does, eventually." He nodded. She said, "You sent me with extra wages." "Mrs. Aldred suggested it." "Mrs. Aldred does what you ask her to do." A short pause in which he did not argue this point. "Thank you," she said. He turned from the window and looked at her fully. In the evening light his face had less of its usual guardedness, not because he had let it down, but because the light was kind and the room was private and she had come back, which was the thing that had been outstanding and was now resolved. He said, "I went to the east corridor every morning while you were gone." She looked at him. "Gormal was there," he continued. "We were both there." Waiting, he said it without embarrassment, which was the thing she had noticed about him most. He did not perform emotions, and he did not hide from them when he decided to speak them. He said things once plainly, and left them for the other person to do with what they would. "I know," she said. "You told me you would." "I did." The evening settled. Gormal, on his platform, made the low sound from his chest that was not a growl and not a sigh, but the sound of an animal that is exactly where it should be. Edmund said, "I would like to show you something." She waited. He turned and led her down the east corridor, to the end, to the door of the locked east room, the room with the painting facing the wall. He had a key in his hand, which meant he had come here with intention, had brought it deliberately, and she understood this was not a sudden thought. He unlocked the door and opened it. The room was plain, with the damp that Mrs. Aldred had said was in the north wall, and the plaster that needed treatment. There was a cloth-covered chair and a small table and the window that looked east, and on the south wall, still facing the wall, the painting. She stood in the doorway and did not go in uninvited. He went to the painting and he turned it around. It was a portrait of a woman, painted with skill and obvious care. She was laughing, not posing, not arranged, but caught in the act of laughing at something, her head tilted slightly, her eyes lit with specific amusement. The kind of painting that is made by someone who knows the subject very well and is trying to preserve not the face but the person. She was, as far as Elspeth could see in the evening light, beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when they are entirely themselves. Edmund stood with his back to the painting for a moment, then he turned and looked at it. "Her name was Catherine," he said. "She died 5 years ago. She was 31. Elspeth said nothing. She let him have the space of it. "I put it away," he said, "because I found it hard too." He stopped, and then continued more carefully, "because I could not have it where I could see it and also function. And after a while having it away became the habit, and I kept the habit past the point it was necessary, because changing it required deciding to change it, and I was not ready to decide." She looked at the painting for a moment. She looked at the laughing woman. "She had good taste in dogs," Elspeth said. He looked at her, then he looked at the painting. Then, and it was the first time she had seen it, a full and real one, unguarded, he smiled. It changed his face. It was, she thought, what his face had always been underneath the careful containment of the years since Catherine, the version before. "She did," he said. "She found him first. The breeder in County Clare was her contact. She convinced me." Elspeth nodded. She looked at the painting once more. Then she looked at Edmund. "The north wall needs treating before autumn, or the damp will be through the plaster," she said. He looked at her with the same expression, the smile becoming something quieter but still there, steady, like a fire that has stopped needing coaxing. "It does. Perrin will know who to bring in. He knows everyone useful in the county." "He does." "She should be in a room that's being used," Elspeth said. "Not locked, that seems wrong." He looked at Catherine. "Yes," he said simply. "I think so too." They stood in the east room as the June evening came down fully outside, and the room was quiet and the painting was out from the wall, and somewhere in the corridor Gormal settled on his sheepskin with the complete satisfaction of an animal whose long project has reached the point it was meant to reach. The summer moved on. The investigation in the north concluded 3 weeks later with a formal finding that revised the original inquest. The record was changed. Elspeth received a letter from Harwick saying so, and she read it in her room by the window and then put it in her drawer and did not think too much more about it, because the thinking had been done a long time ago, and what remained was simply to let the world catch up. The east room was redecorated. Mrs. Aldred arranged the plaster and Perrin arranged the lime wash, and the damp was treated properly, and the portrait of Catherine was moved to the sitting room, where the evening light from the south window fell across it from the right angle, and where it was possible to see her laughing every day from the door. Sixpence took ownership of the sitting room chair. Nobody prevented this. Gormal visited the sitting room occasionally in the evenings, which he had not done before. He would lie on the floor and be present in the way of an animal that has found the arrangement of a household satisfactory. Edmund went to the east corridor less often in the mornings. He went more often to other parts of the house, which were, increasingly, where Elspeth was. The staff of Blackmore Hall understood what was happening with the comprehensive, accurate reading of people who work in close quarters with other people and have no investment in pretending they do not know things. They said nothing and went about their work, and the general mood of the household in that summer was, as Ned eventually said at a Friday supper, the best it had been since he started here, and probably better than that, though he had not been here to know. Mrs. Aldred, who had been here long enough to know, agreed. She did not say she agreed because she rarely said she agreed, but she didn't correct him, which was the same thing. The evening in August that has no dramatic shape and holds the shape of what the whole thing was, what it was really, underneath the visible events, underneath the dog and the letter and the fire and the painting and the investigation and all the specific things that happened. Edmund and Elspeth were in the garden in the long light. They were sitting on the bench that had been put back in the space where the old one had been, which Edmund had arranged without ceremony because she had mentioned once, in passing, that something had stood there, and the worn stone suggested it had stood for a long time. They were not talking about anything at that precise moment. They had been talking earlier about the garden, about a decision regarding the kitchen garden expansion, about a book she had found in the study and had asked about, and that had led to a longer conversation. The talking had run its course, and now there was the bench and the evening and the garden and the light. Gormel was in the heather below the garden wall, doing what he did in summer evenings, some slow, purposeful ranging through the estate that was neither hunting nor walking but something in between, a kind of inspection, a working knowledge of all of it. Edmund said after a while, "You have been here 4 months. "Nearly 5, she said. He looked at the garden, she looked at the garden. "Mrs. Aldred tells me the kitchen garden expansion wants beginning in September if it's going to be ready for spring," he said. "It does. I can start on the planning if you want it." "I want it." She nodded, then she said, without quite looking at him, "Are you going to say something, or are we going to go on talking about the garden?" He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him beside her, the warmth of him in the evening air. "I am going to say something," he said. "I have been working up to it for quite some time, which I recognize is not my most admirable trait." "It is one of your most admirable traits, actually," she said. "You don't say things until you mean them." He looked at her, she looked at him. He said, "I am not built for large gestures or elaborate declarations. I want you to know that about me now because it won't change. But I am also," he looked at the garden for a moment, then back, "I am also very certain about what I want. I have been certain about it for a while." She looked at him steadily. "Tell me what you want." He said, "I want you here. Not in the east corridor with the beeswax and the window frames, though I value that work and I think you do it better than anyone. I want you here, in this house. As it is, with all the things it is and has been. I want to show you the parts I haven't shown you yet, and I want to know the parts of you I don't know yet. And I think that is a better thing to do with a life than the alternative." She held it. She held it for a moment that was long enough to be deliberate, not hesitation, but the receiving of something, the making room for it. Then she said, "Yes." He looked at her, making sure. "I mean yes," she said, "to all of it." The evening held them both, and the garden was very quiet, and somewhere below the wall Gormel came up through the heather and appeared at the garden gate, and looked at the 2 figures on the bench and was perfectly still for a long moment. Then he turned and went back through the gate and down to the south field, because the evening was good and the heather was good, and he had known, from the first morning, exactly what this would come to, and he was not a creature who needed to be present for the confirming of things he had already confirmed long ago. The bench sat in the garden, the light held, the house behind them was warm in its stones. Neither of them moved for a while, and neither of them needed to, and the evening went slowly into dark the way good evenings do, without hurry, without announcement, without anything ending, only the long generous August light becoming gradually stars.